The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dust through the open window of the general store in Green River, Wyoming. And Katherine Parker nearly dropped her leather-bound journal when the door swung open with more force than necessary. She'd been so absorbed in adding shading to the jawline of her latest sketch that she hadn't heard the approaching footsteps on the wooden boardwalk outside. Her heart hammered as she fumbled to close the book, but her hands were clumsy with surprise, and several loose pages slipped free, scattering across the polished wooden counter like autumn leaves caught in a gust. "Sorry about that, madam," a deep voice said, and Catherine's breath caught as she looked up into the face she'd been drawing for the past 3 weeks. Brandon Quincy stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking most of the afternoon sunlight, his hat in his hands as he stepped inside. He was the new ranch hand at the Double Bar property just outside town, and she'd seen him exactly 4 times since he'd arrived in Green River that July of 1882. 4 times had apparently been enough for her artist's eye to memorize every detail of his features, from the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken at least once, to the way his dark hair curled just slightly at his temples when it grew a bit too long. Catherine's hands moved frantically to gather the scattered pages, but Brandon was already bending to help, his movements quick and efficient despite his size. She watched in mounting horror as his fingers closed around one of the sketches, and she knew without looking which one it was. She'd drawn him from memory just that morning, capturing the way she'd seen him 2 days ago outside the saloon, leaning against the hitching post with one boot propped up behind him, his eyes scanning the horizon with a thoughtfulness that had made her wonder what he was thinking about. Time seemed to slow as Brandon's eyes found the image on the page. His expression shifted from helpful concern to surprise, then to something else she couldn't quite name. Katherine felt heat flooding her cheeks, spreading down her neck and across her chest. She wanted to snatch the paper from his hands, to offer some explanation that would make sense, but her tongue felt thick and useless in her mouth. "This is me," Brandon said, and it wasn't a question. His voice held wonder rather than accusation, which somehow made Katherine feel even more exposed. He looked from the sketch to her face, then back to the sketch again, as if trying to reconcile the reality of the situation with what he was seeing. Katherine forced herself to meet his gaze, though it took every ounce of courage she possessed. Her father had always told her that running from the truth never changed it, and she'd lived by that principle even when it was uncomfortable. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, gathering her resolve, she said more clearly, "You've been my muse." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Brandon's eyes widened slightly, and Katherine rushed to explain, the words tumbling out in a torrent she couldn't quite control. "I know it seems strange, and I apologize if it makes you uncomfortable. I'm an artist, or I'm trying to be, and when I see something or someone interesting, I can't help but try to capture it on paper. You have a very distinctive face, good bone structure, and the way you carry yourself. There's a story there, and I suppose I've been trying to figure out what that story is through my drawings." She was rambling now, she knew, but she couldn't seem to stop. Brandon remained quiet, still holding the sketch, his expression unreadable. Other customers had begun to notice their interaction, and Katherine was acutely aware of Mrs. Henderson pretending to examine fabric bolts while clearly eavesdropping, and of Mr. Cho arranging tins of beans with more attention than the task required while his eyes darted toward them. "I have more," Katherine heard herself say, and she wanted to bite her tongue the moment the words left her mouth. Why had she admitted that? But Brandon's expression had shifted to something that looked like curiosity rather than discomfort, so she continued, opening her journal fully for the first time. I keep a visual diary of sorts. It helps me understand the world, to draw what I see and what I feel about what I see. Brandon moved closer to the counter, his attention now fully on the pages she was revealing. There were landscapes of the surrounding wilderness, sketches of townspeople going about their daily lives, studies of horses and cattle, and yes, several more drawings of him. One showed him helping old Mr. Patterson load supplies onto his wagon, his muscles straining under his shirt as he lifted a heavy sack. Another captured him sitting alone at a table in the restaurant, a cup of coffee growing cold as he stared out the window with that same thoughtful expression she'd noticed before. "These are remarkable," Brandon said quietly, and the genuine appreciation in his voice made something warm bloom in Catherine's chest. "I mean it. I've seen paintings in museums back east that weren't half as good as these." Katherine felt her embarrassment beginning to ebb, replaced by a cautious pleasure at his praise. "You've been to museums?" A smile tugged at the corner of Brandon's mouth, transforming his rather serious face into something approaching handsome. "I wasn't always a ranch hand in Wyoming. I had a different life before this one." The way he said it suggested there was indeed a story there, just as Katherine had suspected. She found herself wanting to know everything about him, to understand what had brought him to Green River and what he'd left behind. But she'd already been forward enough for one day, perhaps for an entire lifetime. "What brought you into town today?" Katherine asked, trying to steer the conversation toward safer territory, while simultaneously gathering her scattered pages and tucking them back into her journal with hands that still trembled slightly. "I need to pick up supplies for the ranch," Brandon said, but he didn't move away from the counter. Instead, he handed her back the sketch he'd been holding, his fingers brushing against hers in the exchange. The contact was brief, but sent a jolt of awareness through Katherine that she felt all the way to her toes. "And I was hoping to find a book to read in the evenings. Gets lonely out there sometimes, and I've already read everything I brought with me 3 times over." Katherine's father, who owned the general store, also kept a small lending library in the back room. It had been Katherine's idea, born from her own love of reading, and her recognition that many of the ranch hands and cowboys who came through Green River had little entertainment beyond drinking and gambling. She'd convinced her father that a small selection of books could bring in customers and build goodwill, and to her delight, it had worked better than either of them had anticipated. "We have quite a selection," Katherine said, grateful for the opportunity to regain her composure by focusing on something familiar. "What do you like to read?" "Everything," Brandon answered with a slight shrug. "Philosophy, history, novels. I'm not particular as long as it's well written and makes me think." This surprised Katherine, though she tried not to let it show. Most of the ranch hands who borrowed books wanted dime novels or adventure stories, something to pass the time without requiring too much concentration after a long day of physical labor. "Have you read anything by Mark Twain?" she asked. "Everything he's published," Brandon replied. "I particularly enjoyed his travel writings. The way he observes human nature with both humor and compassion resonates with me." Katherine found herself smiling genuinely now, her earlier embarrassment fading into the background as they discussed literature. She led him to the back room where her father kept the books, pointing out various titles and offering her opinions on each. Brandon listened intently, occasionally asking questions or sharing his own thoughts, and Katherine was struck by how easy it was to talk to him. There was no condescension in his manner, no suggestion that he thought less of her opinions because she was a woman. He treated her as an intellectual equal, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. They spent nearly an hour among the books, their conversation ranging from literature to art to the challenges of life in the Wyoming territory. Katherine learned that Brandon was 24 years old, originally from Boston, and that he'd come west seeking a different kind of life after working in his family's banking business for several years. He didn't elaborate on what had driven him to make such a drastic change, and Katherine didn't press, sensing that the wounds behind that decision were still fresh. For his part, Brandon seemed genuinely interested in Katherine's aspirations as an artist. She was 21 and had been helping her father run the general store since her mother's death 5 years earlier. Her art had been a source of solace during that difficult time, a way to process grief that felt more natural than words. Now it was simply part of who she was, as essential as breathing. "Do you ever sell your work?" Brandon asked as he selected a volume of Emerson's essays to borrow. "I've never tried," Katherine admitted. "I don't know if anyone would want to buy drawings of daily life in Green River." "I would," Brandon said simply, and the directness of his statement made Katherine's heart skip. "That first sketch you did of me, the one I picked up, would you consider selling it?" Katherine's immediate instinct was to refuse. Her drawings were personal, private expressions of her inner world. But something in Brandon's expression made her hesitate. He wasn't asking to possess her work like a trophy. He seemed genuinely moved by what she'd created. "I couldn't accept money for it," Katherine said slowly, "but if you truly want it, you may have it." Brandon's face lit up with a smile that transformed his features completely. "Then I'll trade you for it," he said. "I'm not much of an artist with a pencil, but I can carve. If you give me that sketch, I'll make you something in return." The idea of a fair exchange appealed to Katherine's sense of propriety. She nodded, retrieving the specific sketch from her journal and handing it to Brandon with careful fingers. He took it as if it were something precious, rolling it gently and securing it with a piece of twine he pulled from his pocket. As they returned to the main part of the store, Katherine's father emerged from the storage room where he'd been taking inventory. Robert Parker was a solid man in his early 50s, with graying hair and keen eyes that missed very little. He took in the scene before him with one sweeping glance, noting Brandon's presence, Katherine's flushed cheeks, and the obvious ease between them. "Mr. Quincy," Robert said with a polite nod, "I hope my daughter has been helpful in finding what you need." "Very helpful, sir," Brandon replied. "She has excellent taste in literature." "She gets that from her mother," Robert said, and there was warmth in his voice despite the sadness that always accompanied mentions of his late wife. "Now, you mentioned needing ranch supplies." The conversation shifted to more practical matters as Brandon listed the items he needed to pick up for the Double Bar Ranch. Katherine helped gather them, loading flour, coffee, salt pork, and various other necessities into wooden crates. As she worked, she was hyper-aware of Brandon's presence, of the way he moved, the sound of his voice as he talked with her father about weather patterns and grazing conditions. When everything was loaded onto the wagon Brandon had brought into town, he turned to Katherine one last time. "Thank you for the book and for the drawing. I'll take good care of both." "I know you will," Katherine said, and she found she meant it. There was something inherently trustworthy about Brandon Quincy, a steadiness that made her feel safe in a way she couldn't quite articulate. After he left, Katherine's father gave her a long, considering look. "That's a good man," he said finally. "Quiet, but there's depth there. The ranch foreman speaks highly of him." Katherine busied herself reorganizing the counter, trying to hide the pleased smile that threatened to spread across her face. "He seems nice enough." "Nice enough," her father repeated with amusement in his voice. Is that why you've been drawing him for weeks?" Catherine's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "You knew, Catherine, my dear girl. I've known everything you've done since you were old enough to walk. Did you think I wouldn't notice you staring out the window every time a certain cowboy rode past? Or that you've suddenly developed an urgent need to rearrange the front display every Tuesday afternoon when the double-bar hands come to town?" Heat flooded Catherine's face again, but she saw no judgment in her father's expression, only gentle teasing and perhaps a hint of concern. "I didn't mean to be obvious. You weren't, not to anyone but me," Robert assured her. "And there's nothing wrong with taking an interest in a young man, especially one who seems to have a brain in his head and treats you with respect. Your mother would have liked him, I think." The mention of her mother brought a lump to Catherine's throat. Sarah Parker had been an artist herself, though she'd never had the opportunity to pursue it seriously. She'd encouraged Catherine's talent from the very beginning, saving every scrap of money she could to buy proper drawing supplies, praising every sketch even when Catherine was just learning. One of Catherine's greatest regrets was that her mother hadn't lived to see how much she'd improved, how much of her mother's gift had been passed down to her. "I hope so," Catherine said softly. The rest of the afternoon passed in the normal rhythm of store business. Customers came and went, purchasing supplies, sharing gossip, asking about special orders. But Catherine's mind kept drifting back to Brandon, to the look on his face when he'd seen her drawings, to the warmth in his voice when he'd called them remarkable. She found herself wondering what he was doing at that moment, whether he'd hung her sketch somewhere in his quarters at the ranch, whether he was thinking about their conversation the way she was. That evening, as Catherine prepared dinner for herself and her father in the small apartment above the store, she let herself imagine possibilities she'd never seriously considered before. Romance had always seemed like something that happened to other people, women who were more conventional and less absorbed in their art. But today had shown her that maybe there was room in her life for both passion and partnership, for someone who could appreciate what made her different rather than being threatened by it. The next few weeks passed in a pleasant haze of anticipation and slowly building connection. Brandon came to town more frequently than necessary for ranch business, always finding a reason to stop by the general store. Sometimes he needed to return a book and borrow another. Other times he claimed to require some small item that could easily have waited for the regular supply run. Catherine knew he was making excuses, just as she knew she was doing the same when she found reasons to be in the front of the store during the times he was most likely to appear. They talked about everything and nothing. Brandon told her about growing up in Boston, about the pressure of family expectations and the suffocating feeling of a life already mapped out for him. Catherine shared her memories of her mother, her fears about whether her art was good enough to matter, her occasional frustration with the limited opportunities available to women in the Wyoming territory. Brandon listened with the same focused attention he gave to everything, never dismissing her concerns or trying to offer easy solutions to complicated problems. One afternoon in early August, Brandon arrived at the store with a package wrapped in brown paper. He found Catherine sketching in a quiet moment between customers, her pencil moving across the page as she captured the play of light through the window. "I have something for you," he said without preamble, setting the package on the counter with careful hands. Catherine set down her pencil, her heart beating faster with curiosity and something else she was beginning to recognize as affection. She unwrapped the package slowly, revealing a wooden box about the size of a small book. The wood had been sanded smooth and polished until it glowed with a deep, rich luster. But it was the carving on the lid that made Catherine's breath catch, Brandon had carved a scene of the Wyoming landscape, capturing the rolling hills and distant mountains with remarkable detail. In the foreground, he'd included a small figure of a woman sitting with a sketchbook in her lap, her face turned toward the horizon. The artistry was exceptional, each line purposeful and precise. "I wanted to make something that captured how I see you," Brandon said, and there was vulnerability in his voice that matched what Katherine had felt when he'd first discovered her drawings of him. "You're always watching the world, trying to understand it and interpret it. I thought you might want a special place to keep your pencils and things." Katherine ran her fingers over the carved surface, feeling the texture of the wood, the care that had gone into every detail. "Brandon, this is beautiful. I've never received anything so thoughtful." "Open it," he urged, and she could hear barely contained excitement in his voice. Inside the box, Katherine found a set of drawing pencils ranging from hard to soft lead, the kind she'd seen in catalogs from back east, but could never justify purchasing. There were also several sticks of charcoal, a small knife for sharpening, and a soft cloth for blending. "You mentioned once that you wanted to experiment with different techniques," Brandon said. "I sent away to Denver for these. They arrived on yesterday's stage." Katherine felt tears prickling at her eyes, moved beyond words by the gesture. It wasn't just the gift itself, though that would have been enough. It was the fact that Brandon had been paying attention, that he'd remembered an offhand comment from weeks ago and had taken steps to make her artistic dreams more possible. "Thank you," she managed, looking up at him with eyes that she knew must be shining with emotion. "This means more than I can say." Brandon reached across the counter and took her hand, the first truly intentional touch between them beyond accidental brushes of fingers. His palm was calloused from ranch work but warm and steady. "You have a gift, Katherine. The world should see what you create." They stood like that for a long moment, hands clasped, eyes locked, the air between them charged with possibility. Katherine became aware of the sound of her own breathing, of the way Brandon's thumb was tracing small circles on the back of her hand, of the feeling that something significant was shifting between them. The moment was broken by the jingle of the bell above the door as a customer entered. They sprang apart, both suddenly self-conscious, but Katherine saw the pleased flush on Brandon's cheeks that she was certain was mirrored on her own. That evening, Katherine used the new pencils for the first time, sketching Brandon from memory with more detail than she'd ever attempted before. She captured not just his physical features, but tried to convey the essence of who he was, the thoughtfulness in his eyes, the gentleness in his hands despite their strength, the way he listened as if every word mattered. She worked late into the night, driven by inspiration and by feelings that were growing harder to deny with each passing day. By mid-August, the entire town of Green River seemed aware that something was developing between Katherine Parker and Brandon Quincy. Mrs. Henderson mentioned it to everyone who shopped at her dress shop. Mr. Cho smiled knowingly whenever Brandon came to town. Even the ranch hands from the double bar started teasing Brandon about his frequent trips to the general store, suggesting that the books must be mighty interesting if he needed to discuss them so often. Katherine's father watched the progression of their relationship with approval, but also with a father's natural caution. One evening after closing the store, he sat Katherine down for a conversation that had clearly been brewing for some time. "I like Brandon," Robert began without preamble. "But I need to know that you're being careful with your heart. We don't know much about why he left Boston or what he might be running from." "He's not running from anything wrong," Katherine said, though she realized she was making an assumption based on instinct rather than concrete knowledge. "He's running toward something different," There's a difference. Perhaps, her father acknowledged, but people don't leave behind family and fortune without serious reasons. I just want you to be sure you understand what you might be getting into. Katherine considered her father's words carefully. He wasn't wrong to be cautious. She and Brandon had shared many conversations, but there were still gaps in his history, topics he seemed to avoid. She'd been so caught up in the joy of their growing connection that she hadn't pushed for details about his past. "I'll talk to him," Katherine promised. "Really talk about all of it. If there's something I should know, I want to hear it from him." The opportunity came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, Brandon invited Katherine to go riding on Sunday afternoon, her one guaranteed day off from the store. Robert gave his permission with the caveat that they stay within sight of town, a condition that made Katherine roll her eyes but which she agreed to nonetheless. They rode out to a meadow about a mile from Green River, a place where wildflowers still bloomed despite the late summer heat. Katherine had brought her new pencils and a fresh sketchbook, while Brandon carried a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples in his saddlebags. They spread a blanket under the shade of a cottonwood tree and sat watching the clouds drift across the vast Wyoming sky. "Can I ask you something?" Katherine said after they'd eaten, gathering her courage to broach the subject her father had raised. "Anything," Brandon replied, and she could hear in his voice that he knew this was going to be more than casual conversation. "Why did you really leave Boston? You've told me bits and pieces, but I feel like there's more to the story." Brandon was quiet for so long that Katherine wondered if he was going to answer at all. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest, and began to speak. "I was engaged," he said, and Katherine felt her stomach drop despite knowing she had no claim on him, no right to feel jealous of a past she hadn't been part of. "Her name was Victoria. Our families had known each other for generations, and everyone assumed we'd marry. I assumed it too for a long time." "What happened?" Katherine asked quietly. "I realized I didn't love her," Brandon said simply. "And more than that, I realized I was living a life that didn't belong to me. Every decision had been made before I was old enough to have a say in it. What school I'd attend, what career I'd pursue, who I'd marry, where I'd live. I was 23 years old and I'd never made a single meaningful choice of my own." He picked up a blade of grass and twirled it between his fingers, his eyes fixed on the horizon rather than on Katherine. "Breaking the engagement was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Victoria was a perfectly nice woman, and I hurt her badly. Our families were furious. My father told me I was throwing away my future for a foolish whim. My mother cried and said I was breaking her heart." "But you left anyway," Katherine observed. "I left anyway," Brandon confirmed. "I worked on my family's estate for 6 months, doing manual labor in the stables and on the grounds, figuring out if I could handle physical work. When I was sure I could, I bought a train ticket west and didn't look back. I sent letters once I got settled, letting them know I was alive and well, but I haven't heard back from anyone except my younger sister. She writes every few weeks, usually to tell me about the scandal I caused and how slowly it's dying down." Katherine absorbed this information, understanding now the shadows she sometimes saw in Brandon's eyes. He'd given up everything familiar to pursue a life that felt authentic to him, and that took a kind of courage she deeply respected. "You regret it?" she asked. "Not for a single moment," Brandon said, finally turning to look at her directly. "Especially not since I met you." The intensity in his gaze made Katherine's breath catch. This was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging directly what had been building between them for weeks. "I need you to know something," Brandon continued, his voice low and serious. "I didn't come west looking for a new romance. In fact, I rather thought I'd sworn off the whole idea of love and marriage. The experience with Victoria left me questioning whether those things were even real or just social constructs designed to maintain family alliances and wealth. And now, Katherine prompted, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. Now I know the difference between an arrangement that looks right on paper and something that feels right in every other way, Brandon said. He reached out and took her hand, the gesture familiar now after weeks of small touches and growing intimacy. Katherine, I didn't plan to fall for you, but somewhere between the moment you blushed over those sketches and right now, I did exactly that. Joy surged through Katherine, bright and warm and overwhelming. I fell for you the first time I saw you, she admitted. That's why I started drawing you. You were so different from anyone else in Green River. There was something in your eyes that called to the artist in me, like you were seeing a different world than everyone else, and I wanted to understand what that world looked like. Brandon shifted closer on the blanket until their knees were touching. And do you understand what my world looks like? I'm beginning to, Katherine said. It looks like freedom, like choosing authenticity over comfort, like finding beauty in unexpected places. It looks like you, Brandon said softly, and then he was cupping her face in his hands and kissing her with a gentleness that made Katherine's entire body sing with happiness. The kiss was everything a first kiss should be, sweet and tentative and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Katherine felt as though her entire life had been leading to this moment in this meadow under the endless Wyoming sky. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about the future with the kind of openness that comes after barriers have been broken down. Brandon spoke of his dream to eventually own his own small ranch, nothing grand, just enough land to raise good horses and live simply. Katherine shared her hope of perhaps teaching art classes one day, of passing on the gift her mother had given her. They talked about what a life together might look like, neither of them shying away from the reality of their growing feelings. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made Katherine wish she'd brought her watercolors, they reluctantly packed up and rode back toward town. At the edge of Green River, Brandon helped Katherine down from her horse, his hands lingering on her waist longer than strictly necessary. "Can I call on you properly?" he asked. "Courting, I mean, with all the formality and intention that implies." "I'd like that very much," Katherine replied, smiling up at him with undisguised happiness. "I'll speak to your father tomorrow then," Brandon said. "Do it right this time." That night, Katherine lay in bed unable to sleep, her mind replaying every moment of the afternoon. She thought about Brandon's courage in leaving behind everything he'd known, about his honesty in sharing his past with her, about the way his kiss had felt like coming home to a place she'd never known she was searching for. Brandon was true to his word. The next day, he arrived at the general store in his best clothes, his hair neatly combed, and asked to speak with Robert Parker privately. Katherine tried not to hover near the closed office door, but she couldn't help straining to hear the murmur of voices inside. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 20 minutes, her father emerged with Brandon beside him. "Brandon has asked permission to court you properly," Robert said, his expression serious but his eyes warm. "I've given my blessing, provided you want the same thing." "I do," Katherine said, looking from her father to Brandon and back again. "Very much." "Then I expect to see you at Sunday dinner," Robert told Brandon with a firm handshake, "and I trust you'll continue to treat my daughter with the respect she deserves." "Always, sir," Brandon promised. The courtship that followed was the subject of much discussion in Green River. It was conducted with propriety, Brandon calling on Katherine at regular intervals, bringing small gifts, taking her on chaperoned outings. But beneath the surface of social conventions, something deeper and more profound was growing. They were learning each other's rhythms, discovering how their minds worked in complementary ways, building the foundation of true partnership. Katherine continued to draw, her art flourishing under the influence of happiness. She began sketching other ranch hands and townspeople, and word of her talent spread. To her surprise, people began commissioning drawings, wanting portraits of loved ones or landscapes of favorite places. What had started as a private passion was becoming something more, a way to contribute financially and to make her mark on the world. Brandon, meanwhile, threw himself into ranch work with renewed purpose. He saved every penny he could, knowing that his dream of owning land would require capital he didn't currently possess. The foreman at the double bar, impressed by his dedication and skill with horses, began giving him additional responsibilities that came with a modest increase in pay. In October, as the aspens turned gold and the first hints of winter appeared in the air, Brandon took Katherine back to the meadow where they'd first kissed. The wildflowers were gone now, replaced by dried grasses that whispered in the wind, but the cottonwood tree remained, its leaves a brilliant yellow against the blue sky. "I wanted to bring you back here because this place is special to us," Brandon said, taking both of Katherine's hands in his. "This is where I first told you I'd fallen for you, where we first talked about a future together." Katherine's heart began to race as she saw Brandon reach into his pocket and pull out a small box. It wasn't a ring box, she realized, but something else. "I know we haven't been courting long by conventional standards," Brandon continued, "but I also know that when something is right, you feel it in your bones. Katherine Parker, you've made me believe in love again. Real love, not the kind based on convenience or family expectation, but the kind that makes you want to be a better person. The kind that makes you excited to wake up in the morning because you might get to see her smile. The kind that feels like home." He opened the box, revealing a ring that took Katherine's breath away. It wasn't elaborate or expensive, but it was perfect. The band was silver, carved with delicate patterns that reminded Katherine of the wooden box Brandon had made for her art supplies. Set in the center was a small turquoise stone, the color of the Wyoming sky they both loved. "I can't offer you wealth or high society," Brandon said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't even offer you an easy life, not yet. But I can offer you honesty, partnership, and a love that will never waver. Will you marry me, Katherine? Will you build this new life with me?" Tears were streaming down Katherine's face, but they were tears of joy so pure it felt almost painful. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, absolutely yes." Brandon slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her all along. Then he was kissing her again, deeper than before, with the passion of a man who'd found something he'd thought was lost to him forever. They were married on a crisp Saturday in November, with the whole town of Green River in attendance. Katherine wore a simple but elegant dress that she and Mrs. Henderson had worked on together, its ivory fabric complemented by blue ribbon the exact shade of her engagement ring. She carried wildflowers that Brandon had somehow found still blooming in a protected valley, their colors vibrant against the approaching winter. Robert Parker walked his daughter down the aisle of the small church with tears in his eyes but a smile on his face. Brandon stood at the altar looking handsome and nervous in a new suit, his eyes never leaving Katherine's face as she approached. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Matthews, who'd known Katherine since she was a child and who spoke warmly of love, commitment, and the building of a life together. When Brandon slipped the wedding band onto Catherine's finger, his hand trembled slightly, and Katherine loved him even more for showing his emotions so openly. When she did the same for him, marking him as hers in the eyes of their community and God, she felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. The reception was held at the town hall, with music and dancing and more food than necessary. People Katherine had known her whole life came to wish them well, offering advice and gifts and good-natured teasing. Brandon's fellow ranch hands gave him grief about being domesticated, but it was clear they approved of his choice. Even the normally reserved Mr. Cho became emotional, telling Katherine that her mother would have been proud of the woman she'd become. Late in the evening, as the party continued around them, Brandon pulled Katherine aside to a quiet corner. "Are you happy?" he asked, searching her face as if memorizing every detail. "Happier than I knew was possible," Katherine answered honestly. "Are you?" "I keep thinking about all the choices that led us both to Green River," Brandon said. "All the moments that had to happen exactly as they did for us to find each other. Breaking my engagement, leaving Boston, taking a job at the Double Bar, walking into your father's store on that particular day when you happened to be drawing me. It feels like fate. Or like we were both brave enough to choose the lives we wanted," Katherine suggested. "And those choices brought us together." They'd arranged to rent a small house on the edge of town, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs. Brandon carried Katherine over the threshold, despite her laughing protests, and they spent their first night as husband and wife talking until dawn about their dreams and fears and hopes. When they finally fell asleep, tangled together in the narrow bed, Katherine felt a peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The first year of their marriage was marked by hard work and simple joys. Brandon continued working at the Double Bar while saving every penny toward his dream of buying land. Katherine kept helping her father at the store while taking on more commissioned artwork. She'd begun offering to teach basic drawing classes on Sunday afternoons, and to her surprise, several children and even a few adults had signed up. They fell into rhythms and routines that felt comfortable without being boring. Brandon would leave before dawn for the ranch and return as the sun was setting, tired and dirty, but always greeting Katherine with a kiss and a smile. They'd have dinner together, talking about their days, sharing observations about the people around them and the changing seasons. In the evenings, Brandon would read aloud while Katherine drew, their quiet companionship deepening with each passing day. In February, Katherine realized she was pregnant. She told Brandon on Valentine's Day, presenting him with a sketch she'd drawn of the 3 of them, a family portrait of a future she'd rendered in careful detail. Brandon's reaction was everything she'd hoped for, joy and wonder and a touch of fear at the responsibility ahead. "Are you scared?" Katherine asked that night as they lay in bed, Brandon's hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. "Terrified," he admitted. "I have no idea how to be a father. My own father wasn't exactly a model of warmth and nurturing." "Then you'll be different," Katherine said with confidence. "You'll be the father you needed, the one who listens and encourages and loves unconditionally." "What if I'm not good enough?" Brandon asked, voicing the fear that Katherine suspected lived in the heart of every expectant parent. "You will be," she assured him. "We'll figure it out together, just like we've figured out everything else." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into summer. Katherine continued working at the store as long as she was able, though her father eventually insisted she take more time to rest. Brandon became almost comically protective, worrying if she walked too far or lifted anything heavier than a teacup. Katherine found his concern endearing even when it was excessive. In late August, As the heat of the Wyoming summer reached its peak, Katherine went into labor. Brandon ran for the doctor and for Mrs. Henderson, who'd served as midwife to half the babies born in Green River. Then he paced outside the bedroom, nearly wearing a path in the wooden floor as he listened to Katherine's labored breathing and occasional cries of pain. Robert Parker arrived and put a steadying hand on his son-in-law's shoulder. "She's strong," he said. "Just like her mother. She'll come through this just fine." 14 hours later, as the sun was rising on a new day, Katherine and Brandon's son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry and a full head of dark hair like his father. When Mrs. Henderson placed the baby in Brandon's arms for the first time, the tough cowboy who'd left everything behind to build a new life in Wyoming broke down and wept. They named him Samuel Parker Quincy, after Katherine's maternal grandfather. Sam was a good baby, healthy and alert, with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn chin. Brandon proved to be a natural father despite his fears, patient and gentle with the tiny life they'd created together. Katherine would often wake in the night to find him standing over Sam's cradle, just watching their son sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. As Sam grew from infant to toddler, life in Green River continued its steady pace. Katherine's art classes had become popular enough that she was considering offering them twice a week. Brandon had been promoted to assistant foreman at the double bar, a position that came with better pay and more respect. They'd managed to save a considerable amount toward their dream of buying land, though property prices had risen as more settlers moved into the territory. On a cool evening in October, when Sam was just over 2 years old, Brandon came home with news that made Katherine's heart race with excitement. "The Hendersons are selling their property," he said without preamble. 20 acres on the other side of town, with a small house and a good well. They're moving back east to be near their daughter. Katherine knew without asking that this was their opportunity. The Henderson property wasn't large, but it was exactly what they needed to start their own ranch. "Can we afford it?" she asked. "Just barely," Brandon admitted. "We'd have to use all our savings and take out a small loan. It would mean tightening our belts for a while, but Katherine, it's perfect. There's enough grazing land for a small herd of horses, and the house has good bones. We could make it work." They talked through the night, weighing the risks against the rewards, discussing every possible complication. By dawn, they'd made their decision. Brandon would make an offer on the Henderson property. The negotiations took several weeks, but in the end they reached an agreement. By the first snowfall of 1885, Katherine and Brandon owned their first piece of land. They moved into the Henderson house with Sam and their few possessions, and Brandon immediately began making plans for spring. He'd buy a few good mares and a quality stallion, breeding horses that ranchers in the area would want to purchase. It would take time to build a reputation, but he had patience and skill on his side. Katherine set up a small studio in one corner of the house, a space with good natural light where she could draw and paint while keeping an eye on Sam. Her artwork had gained recognition beyond Green River, with some of her pieces being sold to buyers in Cheyenne and even as far as Denver. She'd begun experimenting with painting as well as drawing, and her landscapes of Wyoming territory were finding an appreciative audience. The first years on their own land were challenging. There were droughts and hard winters, horses that got sick, buyers who fell through. But through it all, Katherine and Brandon faced each obstacle together, their partnership strengthened by shared purpose and genuine love. They celebrated victories and mourned losses, learned from mistakes, and adapted their plans as needed. Sam grew into a bright, curious child who loved both his mother's artistic pursuits and his father's work with the horses. Katherine would find him drawing in the dirt with sticks, creating elaborate scenes of cowboys and animals. Brandon taught him to ride almost as soon as he could walk, sitting him on gentle mares and laughing at his fearless delight. In the spring of 1887, Katherine discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was received with joy rather than fear, both parents confident in their ability to raise another child. Their daughter was born in November, arriving 2 weeks early but healthy and strong. They named her Sarah, after Katherine's mother, and from the moment she opened her eyes, it was clear she'd inherited Katherine's artistic temperament. The rhythm of their life settled into something rich and satisfying. Brandon's horse breeding operation grew steadily, his reputation for quality and fair dealing spreading throughout the region. Katherine's artwork became sought after, with people traveling to Green River specifically to commission pieces. She continued teaching classes, finding joy in nurturing artistic talent in others. By 1890, the Quincy Ranch had become a modest success. They'd expanded to 40 acres, buying the adjacent property when it became available. Brandon employed 2 ranch hands to help with the growing operation. Katherine had converted the old Henderson house into a proper studio and teaching space. While the family lived in a larger home, Brandon had built with his own hands, designing it to Katherine's specifications. Sam, now 8 years old, was already helping with the horses, showing his father's natural affinity for the animals. Sarah, at 3, had her mother's artistic eye and could often be found with a piece of charcoal, drawing on any surface she could find. Katherine had learned to keep plenty of paper on hand to protect their walls. On their 8th wedding anniversary, Brandon surprised Katherine with a gift that left her speechless. He'd commissioned a local carpenter to build her a proper studio, separate from the house, with large windows and enough space to work on multiple pieces at once. It wasn't elaborate, but it showed how much attention he'd paid to her needs and dreams. "You've given me everything I wanted," Katherine said that night as they stood in the new studio, moonlight streaming through the windows. "A home, a family, a partner who truly sees me." "You gave me all that first," Brandon replied, pulling her close. "The day you admitted I'd been your muse, you gave me permission to be seen too. Really seen, not as my family's heir or as a ranch hand, but as myself." They stood together in comfortable silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought them from that moment in the general store to this life they'd built together. It hadn't always been easy, but it had been worth every challenge. Over the next several years, the Quincy family continued to thrive. Sam proved to have a gift for training horses, working alongside his father with patience and skill that belied his young age. Sarah's artistic talent blossomed under Katherine's guidance, and mother and daughter would spend hours together in the studio, creating side by side. Brandon's horses gained recognition at regional shows and sales, with buyers coming from across Wyoming and neighboring territories to purchase from his stock. The ranch had expanded to nearly 100 acres, supporting a small but quality herd. Brandon had also begun taking in troubled or difficult horses, ones that other trainers had given up on, and rehabilitating them with patience and understanding. It was work that suited his temperament, and Katherine saw echoes of his own journey from Boston in the way he approached these difficult cases. Katherine's artistic career had evolved in directions she'd never anticipated. In addition to her commissioned work and teaching, she'd begun illustrating children's books, collaborating with a writer in Cheyenne to create stories set in the Wyoming territory. The books were gaining popularity, bringing both income and recognition. Several galleries in Denver now displayed her work regularly, and she'd even had pieces shown in San Francisco. In 1895, when Sam was 13 and Sarah was 8, Brandon and Katherine added another member to their family. Little Thomas arrived in June, surprising his parents who thought their family was complete. Thomas was a happy, easygoing baby who seemed content to observe the busy household around him with calm interest. Robert Parker, now in his late 60s, had finally retired from running the general store, selling it to a young couple from back east. He spent most of his time at the ranch now, doting on his grandchildren and helping with lighter tasks. He'd become one of Brandon's closest confidants, and the two men could often be found discussing horses, politics, or philosophy, while working side by side. As the century drew to a close, Green River had grown from the small frontier town Katherine and Brandon had known in their youth. The railroad had brought more settlers, and the downtown area now boasted several new businesses. But despite the changes, the essence of the place remained, that blend of independence and community that had drawn Brandon west in the first place. In the spring of 1900, Katherine and Brandon celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. They'd aged, Brandon now 42 with silver threading through his dark hair, Katherine 39 with laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of a life well lived. But the connection between them had only deepened, their early passion maturing into something even more profound. They threw a party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors to celebrate with them. The house and yard were full of people, children running and playing, adults sharing stories and laughter. Sam, now 18, was preparing to leave for the state university in Laramie in the fall, planning to study veterinary medicine. Sarah, 13, had just sold her first painting to a buyer in Cheyenne, launching her own artistic career. Thomas, at 5 years old, was a miniature version of his father, already showing an interest in everything related to the ranch. As the sun set and the party continued around them, Katherine found herself drawn to the studio. She stood at the window, looking out at the land they'd built their life on, at the horses grazing in the pasture, at the home full of light and love and laughter. Brandon joined her, slipping his arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About that day in the store," Katherine said, "when you found my sketch of you. I was so embarrassed, but also, somewhere deep down, I think I was hoping you'd find it, hoping you'd see yourself the way I saw you." "I'm glad I did," Brandon said softly. "That was the moment everything changed. The moment I realized someone could look at me and see possibilities instead of expectations." Katherine turned in his arms to face him, studying the face she'd drawn dozens of times over the years, the face she'd memorized in every mood and light. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving Boston, all of it?" "Never," Brandon said firmly. "Every difficult choice, every sacrifice led me to you, to this life. How could I regret that?" They kissed, a kiss that held 15 years of marriage and partnership, of challenges overcome and joys celebrated. Around them, through the studio windows, they could see their children playing with their friends, Robert laughing at something Sam had said. The ranch hands Brandon employed sharing drinks and stories by the barn. "We should probably get back to the party," Katherine said, though she made no move to pull away. "Probably," Brandon agreed, also not moving. "But let's stay here just another moment, just us, remembering how it all started." So they stood together in the studio Katherine had once only dreamed of having, on the land Brandon had worked so hard to acquire, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together. Two people who'd had the courage to reach for what they wanted, who'd found each other at exactly the right moment, who'd chosen love and partnership over easier paths. "You've been my muse," Katherine whispered, echoing the words she'd said so many years ago, words that had started everything. "And you've been my inspiration," Brandon replied. "My reason for believing that choosing authenticity over expectation was worth the cost. My proof that love is real, not just a social construct or a family arrangement." As they finally returned to the party, hand in hand, Katherine felt a profound gratitude for every twist and turn that had brought them together. For the day Brandon had walked into her father's store and found her sketches, for her courage in admitting the truth, for his openness in receiving it, for all the small moments and large decisions that had woven their lives together into something beautiful and enduring. The years continued to pass, each bringing its own mixture of joy and challenge. Sam graduated from university and returned to Green River, opening a veterinary practice that served ranchers throughout the region. He married a teacher named Emma, and they gave Katherine and Brandon their first grandchild in 1903. Sarah spent several years studying art in Denver before returning home to establish herself as one of the region's most respected artists, eventually opening her own gallery in Cheyenne. Thomas followed his father's path into horse training, proving to have an almost uncanny ability to communicate with even the most difficult animals. Robert Parker passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1902, at the age of 72. He'd lived long enough to see all three of his grandchildren thriving, to know that his daughter had found genuine happiness, to be present for the birth of his first great-grandchild. At his funeral, Katherine spoke about how her father had supported her artistic dreams even when they seemed impractical, how he'd welcomed Brandon into their family without reservation, how he'd been the foundation of stability that allowed her to take risks. Brandon and Katherine continued working the ranch together, though they gradually transitioned more responsibility to Thomas as they aged. Brandon was known throughout Wyoming for his skill with horses and his integrity in business dealings. Katherine's artwork had been displayed in galleries across the western states, and her illustrated books had become classics of children's literature. But more than their individual accomplishments, they were known as a partnership, two people who'd built something meaningful together. In 1910, on their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a surprise party at the ranch. Friends and family came from across the state to celebrate. Sam and Emma brought their 3 children. Sarah came with her husband Marcus, whom she'd met at an art exhibition in Denver. Thomas, now 15 and already taller than his father, had helped plan the entire event. The party was elaborate, with tables laden with food, musicians playing, speeches and toasts celebrating Katherine and Brandon's life together. But the gift that moved Katherine most came from Sarah, who presented her parents with a leather-bound book she'd created. Inside were reproductions of Katherine's original sketches of Brandon, the ones that had started everything. Sarah had carefully copied each one, preserving the raw emotion and artistic skill of her mother's early work. But she'd also included new drawings, ones Katherine had made over the years, creating a visual timeline of their love story. There was Brandon helping Sam learn to ride. Brandon and Katherine standing in front of their new house. Brandon holding newborn Thomas. Dozens of moments captured in Katherine's distinctive style, telling the story of their life together. "I wanted you to see what I see when I look at your work," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just technical skill, though that's certainly there, but love. Every drawing you've ever made of Father, from that very first one to last week, they're all love letters rendered in graphite and charcoal." Katherine couldn't speak through her tears, could only hold the book and flip through its pages while Brandon looked over her shoulder. He was crying too, she realized, unashamed of his emotion as he studied the images of their life together. That night, after the guests had departed and the ranch had settled into quiet darkness, Katherine and Brandon sat on the porch of their home, wrapped in blankets against the cool spring air. They passed the book back and forth, remembering the moments each sketch represented. "You know what I think about sometimes," Brandon said, his voice reflective. "That young man who left Boston, so sure he knew what he was running toward. I had no idea, not really. I thought I was seeking freedom and authenticity, and I was, but I was also seeking you. I just didn't know it yet." "I think about the girl I was," Katherine replied. "So absorbed in my art, so certain that love and partnership weren't for women like me. I'd convinced myself that I had to choose between being an artist and having a family. You showed me I could have both, that the right partner enhances rather than diminishes who you are." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the Wyoming night, the distant whinny of horses, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods Brandon had planted years ago, the occasional call of a night bird. This land, this life, this love, it was everything they'd worked for and more than they'd dared to dream. The years moved forward as years always do. Brandon and Katherine grew older, their hair graying, their movements slower, but their love undiminished by the passage of time. They became grandparents several times over, delighting in watching the next generation grow and develop their own personalities and passions. They maintained the ranch as long as they were physically able, eventually turning full operation over to Thomas, who had married and started his own family. But they remained active in the community, Brandon serving on the town council and Katherine continuing to teach art to anyone who wanted to learn. In 1920, on the occasion of their 35th wedding anniversary, the town of Green River honored them with a celebration recognizing their contributions to the community. It was a bittersweet event, as the world had changed dramatically since their wedding day. The century had turned, Wyoming had achieved statehood, the Great War had come and gone, and Green River had transformed from a frontier town into an established community. But some things remained constant. The love between Katherine and Brandon, tested by time and strengthened by shared experience, was as real and vital as it had been when they first admitted their feelings in that meadow full of wildflowers. They still held hands when they walked, still sought each other's counsel on important decisions, still found joy in each other's company after all these years. Katherine continued to draw, her subject matter evolving but her skill never diminishing. She'd filled dozens of sketchbooks over the decades, creating a visual record of her life in times that would be valued by historians and art lovers alike. And in all those sketchbooks, in all those years of work, Brandon remained her most frequent subject. She drew him at every age and every season, capturing the man she loved in all his complexity and depth. On a warm summer evening in 1925, when Katherine was 65 and Brandon 67, they took one final ride together to the meadow where Brandon had proposed. It had taken some effort to arrange, as neither of them rode much anymore, but their children had helped make it possible, saddling gentle horses and accompanying them at a discreet distance. They spread a blanket under the same cottonwood tree, now massive and gnarled with age. The meadow looked different than it had 40 years earlier, but the essential character of the place remained. They sat close together, Katherine's head resting on Brandon's shoulder, watching the sun paint the sky in familiar colors. "You remember what you said to me here?" Brandon asked, his voice still strong despite his years. "That I'd fallen for you the first time I saw you," Katherine replied with a smile. "That I'd started drawing you because I wanted to understand the world you saw. And do you?" Brandon asked, the same question he'd posed all those years ago. Understand what my world looks like. Katherine considered the question seriously, as she always did. Your world looks like integrity, she said finally. Like courage to choose your own path. Like love that doesn't demand, but instead supports and encourages. Like a man who became exactly who he was meant to be, because he was brave enough to reject who others expected him to be. Brandon kissed her forehead, a gesture of tenderness that had remained constant through their decades together. And my world looks beautiful, he said softly, because you're in it. Because you saw something in a confused cowboy who walked into your father's store and decided he was worth knowing, worth drawing, worth loving. They stayed in the meadow until the stars came out, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the life they'd built, about the art Katherine still wanted to create, and the horses Brandon still hoped to train. They talked about the future with the same optimism they'd always possessed, even as they acknowledged that their time was growing shorter. When they finally returned to the ranch, their children waiting to welcome them home, Katherine felt a deep sense of completion. She'd lived a full life, rich with love and creativity and purpose. She'd been true to herself and to the talents she'd been given. She'd raised children who were good people, made a lasting mark through her art, and loved a man who'd loved her back with unwavering devotion. Brandon and Katherine lived several more years, each one precious and fully embraced. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, welcomed new great-grandchildren, and continued to be active parts of their family and community. When Katherine's hands finally became too arthritic to draw with her former precision, Brandon would sit with her and describe what she wanted to create, and their grandchildren would help bring her visions to life under her guidance. Brandon remained strong longer than Katherine, his body hardened by decades of physical labor. But when Katherine's health began to fail in the winter of 1930, he never left her side. He rode to her, held her hand, told her stories of their life together, reminded her of every reason he'd fallen in love with her in that general store nearly 50 years earlier. Katherine Parker Quincy passed away peacefully in her sleep on a February morning, surrounded by her family, in the home Brandon had built for her. She was 70 years old and had lived to see her art recognized, her children successful and happy, and her grandchildren beginning to build their own lives. Most importantly, she'd been loved and had loved in return with a depth and constancy that most people only dream of. Brandon held her hand as she drew her last breath, tears streaming down his weathered face, but also gratitude in his heart for every moment they'd shared. At her funeral, attended by what seemed like half of Wyoming, he spoke about the day he'd found her sketches, about how her blushing admission that he'd been her muse had changed the entire course of his life. "She saw me before I saw myself," Brandon said, his voice breaking but determined to be heard. "She captured something true with her artist's eye, and then she had the courage to share it. Everything good in my life came from that moment of vulnerability and honesty. She taught me that being seen, truly seen, isn't something to fear, but something to embrace." Brandon lived 3 more years after Katherine's death, remaining active on the ranch and involved with his family. But everyone could see that part of him had gone with her. He kept all of her sketchbooks in his room, and he would spend hours looking through them, remembering the life they'd built together. The children and grandchildren would find him smiling at her drawings, running his fingers over the lines she'd made, as if he could reach through the paper to touch her one more time. In the spring of 1933, Brandon Quincy passed away quietly in his sleep. He was 75 years old, and according to his children, he went peacefully with Katherine's name on his lips. They buried him beside Katherine in the Green River Cemetery, under a shared headstone that listed their names, dates, and a simple inscription that Sam had chosen. They saw each other truly. The ranch remained in the Quincy family, passing to Thomas and eventually to his children. Katherine's artwork gained even more recognition after her death, with several museums acquiring her pieces for their permanent collections. Her illustrated children's books remained in print, introducing new generations to the Wyoming territory she'd captured so beautifully. But perhaps her most important legacy was the love story she'd lived, a testament to the power of authenticity, courage, and genuine partnership. Years later, when historians and art critics studied Katherine's work, they would marvel at the recurring subject throughout her career. Hundreds of drawings and paintings of the same man, rendered at different ages and in different circumstances, but always with the same underlying emotion. Love, captured in graphite and charcoal, in watercolor and ink. A visual record of a life shared, of a partnership that had enriched both people and created something beautiful that lasted beyond their individual lives. The story of Katherine and Brandon became part of Green River's history, told and retold to new generations. The tale of how a cowboy found sketches of himself in a young woman's journal, how she blushed and admitted he'd been her muse, and how that moment of vulnerability and honesty had led to one of the great love stories of the American West. It was a reminder that love could flourish in unexpected places, that courage and authenticity could build something lasting, and that two people who were brave enough to truly see each other could create a legacy that endured long after they were gone. Their great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren would grow up hearing the story, seeing Katherine's artwork displayed in their homes, riding horses descended from Brandon's breeding stock. The ranch remained a family operation well into the 21st century, a testament to the foundation Katherine and Brandon had built together. And in the house that Brandon had constructed with his own hands, in the studio he had built to support Katherine's dreams, their descendants continued to live and love and create, building their own stories on the foundation of courage and authenticity that Katherine and Brandon had established so many years before. The love story that began with a sketch and a blush had rippled forward through time, touching countless lives, proving that when two people are brave enough to be truly seen, when they choose each other with full hearts and open eyes, they create something that transcends their individual lives. Katherine and Brandon had found each other in the wild expanse of the Wyoming territory, two people seeking authenticity in a world that often demanded conformity, and together they'd built a life of meaning, purpose, and enduring love. Their story reminded everyone who heard it that love is both a choice and a gift, that partnership requires courage and vulnerability, and that the most beautiful art is the life you build with someone who truly sees you. From that first moment in the general store to their final days together, Katherine and Brandon had lived their truth, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would inspire generations to come. And in the end, that was everything either of them had ever hoped to achieve.